This is M1 MacBook Pro 13-inch review. Apple's little MacBook Pro gets a big refresh. The MacBook Pro 13-inch, M1, 2020, is the most exciting laptop Apple has released in years. The new M1 chip offers exceptional battery life, and in our early testing performance has been excellent. It's just a shame about the old design. The MacBook Pro 13-inch, M1, 2020, is a watershed moment for Apple's Pro line. That's because, along with the MacBook Air, M1, 2020, and the Mac Mini, M1, 2020 that launched at the same time, it has moved Apple into a new era. Instead of using Intel CPUs that have powered all of the company's computers for a while now, it uses the new Apple-made M1 chip. This upgrade to the laptop line is the first truly big leap that it has seen in a long time. Though we would have loved to see an additional port or two and a design update, the new MacBook Pro 13-inch is a fantastic update for Apple's top line of portables. Apple has yet again redefined what we can expect from a laptop. Prices for the MacBook Pro 13-inch, M1, 2020, start at $1,299, £1,299, £1,999 Australian dollars for the 256GB SSD/8GB RAM model, with the 2TB SSD/16GB RAM model selling for $2,299, £2,299, £3,499 Australian dollars. Both models come with the same M1 chip with an 8-core CPU and 8-core GPU, and storage can be configured up to 2 TB. For comparison, the MacBook Pro 2020 launched earlier this year for $1,299, £1,299, £1,999 Australian dollars, so we're not seeing the price cut on the MacBook Pro some were hoping to see now that Apple has moved to its own silicon, but we commend Apple for releasing the new version at the same price as the previous model. What's interesting is that the new MacBook Air, M1, 2020, is available with the same M1 chip, and with the same amount of RAM and 512GB storage, for $1,249, £1,249, £1,949 Australian dollars. Usually, we wouldn't compare the MacBook Pro with the MacBook Air, but considering how close the specs are, and the fact that new MacBook Air also features a screen that supports the P3 color gamut, previously exclusive to MacBook Pros, there may be some people who think going for the Air is a better choice, especially as it comes with double the capacity for less money. However, the MacBook Air, M1, 2020, has a fanless design, whereas the MacBook Pro 13-inch, M1, 2020, still has fans. This means the new MacBook Air is limited in how long it can run intensive tasks for before its performance is throttled in order to prevent overheating, due to there being no fans to cool it down. The MacBook Pro 13-inch, M1, 2020, is one of the most exciting releases from Apple for a while, thanks to its new M1 silicon brains, but you probably wouldn't think that when you first get it out of the box. That's because, with its dimensions of 0.61 by 11.97 by 8.36 inches, 1.56 by 30.41 by 21.24 centimeters and a weight of 3.0 pounds, 1.4 kilograms, it's pretty much the same as the previous model. It certainly looks and feels identical to previous MacBook Pro 13-inch models, so anyone hoping for a radical new look to match the radical new hardware within is going to be disappointed. Apple would probably argue, along with some of its fans, that the MacBook Pro 13-inch's design is perfect, so there's no point changing it. In a way that's fair, this is still a good-looking laptop after all, and it remains impressively thin and light, but when Apple's rivals, such as Dell and HP, are doing some innovative things with their designs, be it super slim bezels or 2-in-1 designs that let you use the laptop like a tablet, the MacBook Pro 13-inch, M1, 2020's look starts to feel a little dated. It's a bit of a shame, as in other respects, the revolutionary M1 chip and the improvements the company has brought to macOS Big Sur, it does feel like Apple is excited about MacBooks again. Still, for the purpose of this MacBook review, the design of the MacBook Pro 13-inch, M1, 2020, isn't bad by any means, just rather familiar, and that sense of familiarity is maintained when you open the laptop. The touch bar returns. If you're not familiar with this, it's a thin touchscreen that runs along the top of the keyboard, and which shows context-sensitive buttons and shortcuts depending on what app or tool you're currently using. The keyboard is the same Magic Keyboard as the one introduced with the MacBook Pro 13-inch from earlier this year. This was a welcome change at the time, as it replaced the controversial butterfly switch keyboard, which was often prone to reliability problems. It's good to see it back in the new MacBook Pro 13-inch, and it again feels great to type on. the screen is also unchanged, with a Retina resolution of 2560 by 1600. This results in a sharp image, but again Apple is being outclassed here by rivals such as HP and Dell, who are putting higher resolution screens on their 13-inch laptops. Still, the screen of the Apple MacBook Pro 13-inch, M1, 2020, remains bright and vibrant. It also supports the P3 wide color gamut, offering excellent color reproduction. This is great for photographers and video editors, who need true-to-life colors, but it's worth pointing out that the new MacBook Air, M1, 2020, also now comes with P3 wide color support. This makes the more affordable MacBook Air a viable alternative for budget-conscious creatives, and deprives the MacBook Pro of a key selling point. When it comes to ports, the Apple MacBook Pro 13-inch, M1, 2020, sticks with just the two Thunderbolt 3 ports, both on the left-hand side, and an audio jack on the right. In our time with the MacBook Pro 13-inch, M1, 2020, we've been impressed by its performance. Apple talked a big game about the M1 chip, and claims that its CPU is 2.8 times faster at building Xcode projects, and delivers twice as fast vector performance in Affinity Photo, plus 5.9 times the 3D title render speeds in Final Cut Pro and 2.9 times the performance in Shadow of the Tomb Raider thanks to its GPU. Now that we've had the MacBook Pro 13-inch, M1, 2020 for a while, we can delve deeper into its performance. We ran both native M1 apps and older legacy apps designed for Intel Macs, and they performed really well. We opened up several demanding apps at once, and swapped between them, and throughout macOS Big Sur didn't miss a beat. They opened quickly, and switching between them was almost instantaneous. Unlike the new MacBook Air, M1, 2020, which runs silently thanks to its fanless design, the MacBook Pro 13-inch, M1, 2020, does still have fans, and they do kick in after a while when you're doing some strenuous work on the device. The laptop also gets rather warm towards the back at times. However, the fans don't ever get too distracting, and for day-to-day use you'll never hear them. The fact that the MacBook Pro 13-inch, M1, 2020, has fans means it can work harder and longer than the MacBook Air, M1, 2020, as well. Due to its fanless design, the new MacBook Air has to throttle performance, by lowering the speed of the M1 chip, to avoid overheating. This makes the Pro the better choice for professionals that are using it for prolonged intensive tasks, such as rendering complex 3D animations. The benchmark results were also incredibly impressive. We'd seen leaked Cinebench scores suggesting that the M1 chip can beat powerful Intel 11th Gen chips, and it proved to be correct. In the intensive Cinebench R23 benchmark, the MacBook Pro 13-inch, M1, 2020 scored a whopping 768 points in the multi-core test. That puts it well above the performance of the entry-level MacBook Pro 16-inch with a 6-core 9th generation Intel Core i7 processor. The fact that the laptop sells for $2,399, £2,399, $3,799 which is around $1,000/$1,000 more, and has a dedicated graphics card, casts the cheaper MacBook Pro 13-inch, M1, 2020's performance in a very positive light. We also had a play around with Final Cut Pro, Apple's video editing software which has been updated to run on the M1 chip, and used it to editing an 8K video using multiple sources. The MacBook Pro 13-inch, M1, 2020, kept up admirably, allowing us to scrub through the footage while showing a preview of the video at the same time. It was seriously impressive. The app did crash once on us, however, when we were adding some titles and fancy effects, but that appeared to be a one-off. Apple claims that the MacBook Pro 13-inch, M1, 2020, has the longest battery life ever in a Mac, promising a huge 17 hours of wireless web browsing, and up to 20 hours of video playback, a whopping 10 hours more than the previous model. In our battery life benchmark test, the MacBook Pro 13-inch, M1, 2020, lasted 13 hours and 22 minutes. During this test we play a loop 1080p video with the screen at 50% brightness until the battery dies. Now, while that isn't quite as long as the 20 hours Apple was claiming, it's still a very impressive score, and a decent improvement over the earlier 2020 Intel model, which lasted 8 hours and 31 minutes in the same test. That around a 5-hour bump, seriously impressive. It's also longer than the MacBook Pro 16-inch's record of 11 hours and 41 minutes, and also beats the latest Dell XPS 13 model, which scored 11 hours. The battery life of the Apple MacBook Pro 13-inch, M1, 2020, is so impressive, that we were actually able to use it straight out of the box, and didn't plug it in for a couple of days later. This was doing a bit of light use, browsing the web and writing emails, so when it comes to much more intensive tasks, that battery life is going to deplete faster. Still, This is very impressive.